September 22nd, 1945. Bad Tilts, Bavaria. 1400 hours. Oberregierungsrat Heinrich Miller sat at his desk in the Bavarian Ministry of Economics, 3 floors above the street where American jeeps rolled past every 15 minutes. The building still smelled of fresh paint. Someone had tried to cover the scorch marks from the final bombardment in April. Miller was 42 years old. He had joined the Nazi Party in March 1937, not because he believed, but because staying employed as a senior civil servant required membership. Party number 4,873,912. The card now hidden beneath a floorboard in his apartment, along with the uniform he'd never worn and the armband he'd never put on. For 137 days since surrender, Miller had waited. Every morning expecting the knock on his door, the American MPs with his name on a list. The transfer to an internment camp where 8.5 million other Germans, 1 in 9 adults, were being processed, categorized, condemned. Then the intelligence summary arrived on his desk at 14:30 hours. General Patton had spoken to the press. The transcript was already circulating through Bavaria's administrative offices. Someone, probably his friend Karl in the finance ministry, had underlined the key passage in red ink. Miller read it 3 times. This Nazi thing is just like a Democrat and Republican election fight. He set down the paper. Outside, an American sergeant shouted orders in English. Miller's hands were shaking. The most famous American general, the man whose Third Army had crushed Wehrmacht units from Normandy to Czechoslovakia, was saying party membership didn't matter. For the first time since May 8th, Heinrich Miller allowed himself to breathe. It lasted 4 days. To understand what destroyed Patton, you must first understand what Bavaria looked like in September 1945. The Reich had been dead for 137 days. In those 137 days, the Allied powers had implemented something called denazification, the systematic removal of every Nazi Party member from any position of authority or influence. The policy wasn't subtle, it wasn't selective, it was absolute. The Potsdam Declaration, signed August 2, 1945 by President Truman, Generalissimo Stalin, and British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, stated explicitly that Nazi Party members would be removed from public office and from positions of responsibility in important private undertakings. No exceptions, no explanations, no second chances. The numbers were staggering. 8.5 million Germans had been members of the Nazi Party, roughly 11% of the population. In Bavaria, where the party had been founded in a Munich beer hall in February 1920, the percentage was higher. 14%. Nearly 1 in 7 adults carried a party card. By September 1945, American military government forces had already removed 132,000 Germans from their positions across the American zone. In Bavaria specifically, 49,887 officials had been terminated in 4 months. Teachers, postal workers, railway administrators, water system engineers, police officers, judges, factory managers, anyone whose file showed NSTAP membership was gone. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, had made denazification his personal crusade. On July 7, 1945, he issued a directive to all commanders that was unambiguous: former Nazis must be removed promptly and without exception from any position where they could influence German society, economy, or government. Then he placed George S. Patton, Jr. in charge of Bavaria as military governor of the Eastern Military District. It was the single worst personnel decision Eisenhower made in 46 years of military service. Patton had liberated more German territory than any other Allied commander. He had killed more German soldiers. He had captured more German prisoners, but he had no idea how to govern Germans. Worse, he didn't think he should have to. George Smith Patton Jr. arrived in Bavaria with a reputation that transcended military achievement. To Americans, he was old blood and guts, the general who had slapped sense into cowards, raced tanks across France, and relieved Bastogne in 72 hours during the coldest winter in 50 years. To the Germans, he was something else entirely. Wehrmacht intelligence had tracked Patton obsessively during the war. When his Third Army became operational on August 1, 1944, German commanders in Normandy immediately requested additional panzer divisions. When Patton's units were identified in Lorraine in September, the entire German Seventh Army shifted its defensive posture. Oberst Hermann Balck, who commanded panzer forces against Patton at Aracourt, wrote in his post-war assessment, "Patton was the most dangerous Allied commander we faced. Not the most methodical, that was Montgomery. Not the most resourceful, that was Bradley. The most dangerous." He understood what Guderian understood, that speed defeats armor, that exploitation defeats defense, that momentum is a weapon more powerful than artillery. The statistics proved Balck correct. In 281 days of continuous combat from August 1944 to May 1945, Patton's Third Army had suffered 137,000 casualties while inflicting more than 1.4 million on German forces, a kill ratio of better than 10 to 1. His army captured more than 80,000 square miles of territory. They fought in 6 countries. They liberated or captured 12,000 cities and towns. The Germans respected that kind of brutality. They understood it. What they couldn't understand, what nobody understood, was what Patton would do in peace. Bavaria in summer 1945 was experiencing what American military government officers called administrative paralysis. The bureaucracy that had managed Bavaria's 8 million people for 12 years, controlling everything from water purification to food rationing to coal distribution, had been staffed almost entirely by Nazi party members. Because under Hitler, party membership wasn't optional. If you wanted to be a railway administrator, you joined. If you wanted to be a school teacher, you joined. If you wanted to be a postal clerk, you joined. The alternative was unemployment, suspicion, and, in many cases, arrest. Minister-President Fritz Schaefer, installed by American forces in May, understood the problem intimately. Schaefer himself had been imprisoned in Dachau concentration camp from 1933 to 1934 for his Catholic political activism. He was ideologically clean. But he couldn't find enough clean Germans with the technical knowledge to operate a modern state. On September 11, 1945, Schaefer submitted his resignation after American investigators discovered that several of his ministerial subordinates had concealed their Nazi affiliations. Eisenhower's headquarters in Frankfurt demanded immediate action. Patton was ordered to fix Bavaria's denazification problem. Instead, 11 days later, he walked into a press conference and said the thing that would end his career. The press conference convened at Third Army headquarters in Bad Thiels at precisely 1400 hours on September 22, 1945. Weather records show the temperature at 17 degrees Celsius with intermittent clouds. 18 correspondents attended, including Victor Bernstein of the left-leaning New York newspaper PM, Ray Daniel of the New York Times, Ed Morgan of the Chicago Daily News, and Carl Levin of the New York Herald Tribune. Also present, Parker W. Berman, a State Department political advisor who had been assigned to Patton's staff just 5 days earlier specifically to help manage the denazification crisis. Berman sat in the corner, taking notes. He would later tell colleagues at the U.S. Group Control Council in Berlin that he knew within 5 minutes the conference was going to be catastrophic. Patton entered the room at 1403 hours wearing his immaculate dress uniform, 3 stars gleaming, riding crop in hand, pearl-handled revolvers conspicuously absent. His adjutant called the room to attention. Patton waved everyone to sit. The first question came from Daniel. Was the general satisfied that Bavaria's government had been adequately denazified? Patton's response was immediate and characteristically unguarded. He declared that he was not trying to be king of Bavaria and that as far as he was concerned, Germans could run their political affairs however they wished as long as his orders were carried out. When correspondents pointed out that liberal German politicians were complaining that while the legs and forepaws of the Nazi beast had been lopped off, the body remained, Patton's response was sharp. Reactionaries? Do you want a lot of communists? I don't know anything about parties. I'm here to see that they do what they're told. The correspondents pressed harder. How did the general justify the continued employment of Nazi Party members in administrative positions? Patton responded that he had never seen the necessity of the denazification program. He stated, and 3 correspondents recorded this in their shorthand, that 98% of the Nazis were just camp followers of the party because it was in power or had been forced unwillingly into membership. Morgan of the Chicago Daily News interrupted, General, 98%? Patton backtracked slightly. He was given to hyperbole, he explained. What he meant was that a large part of party members had joined under duress or opportunism. Then came the question that destroyed him. Ed Morgan asked directly, General, how is employing Nazis in your administration any different from the policy we were supposedly fighting against? Patton's answer was recorded verbatim by 4 different correspondents. The transcripts match almost word for word. Well, I'll tell you. This Nazi thing is just like a Democrat and Republican election fight. Silence. Patton continued, apparently unaware of what he'd just said. The thing was that these damned Nazis got other people by the scruff of the neck, and other Germans just didn't have the guts to go back. Victor Bernstein asked him to repeat the comparison. Patton, now sensing dangerous ground, said he hoped correspondents wouldn't put him on the spot by an exact quotation and that he was speaking in exaggerated terms. Parker Berman stopped taking notes. He would later report to Robert Murphy, the senior U.S. political advisor for Germany, that he'd immediately recognized the comment would cause a political firestorm. The conference continued for another 23 minutes. Patton elaborated on his belief that the priority should be showing the German people what grand fellows we are, and that getting Bavaria's economy functioning was more important than ideological purity. He argued that American taxpayers would have to foot the bill for German relief if the bureaucracy remained paralyzed. When the correspondents departed at 14:51 hours, they had everything they needed. Within 3 hours, the transcripts reached Frankfurt via military telegraph. Within 12 hours, they reached Washington. Within 24 hours, they were on the front page of the New York Times under the headline, Patton belittles denazification, holds rebuilding more important. The New York Times article, published September 23rd, reported that Patton's views appeared to be in conflict with the ideas laid down in the Potsdam Declaration and General Eisenhower's directives. The article noted that many of Patton's subordinate officers shared his opinions and that these views were similar in many respects to views expressed from the beginning by German apologists themselves. What the German bureaucrats like Heinrich Miller understood immediately, what Patton's own staff had known for months, was that the general had been thinking this way since May. He simply hadn't articulated it publicly. The evidence had been building. Robert Murphy, acting on a request from General Lucius Clay, Eisenhower's deputy, had visited Munich from September 28th to October 1st to investigate reports that Bavaria's denazification program was being deliberately sabotaged. Murphy spent 3 days interviewing Patton, his military government officers, and German politicians from across the political spectrum. Murphy's report, transmitted to Secretary of State James Burns on October 3rd, was diplomatically phrased, but damning. It has been apparent for some time past that General Patton and members of his staff might not be in sympathy with some features of our policy, especially denazification. The German politicians Murphy interviewed provided specific examples. Wilhelm Hochner, a social democrat who had fled Germany in June 1933 and spent 12 years in exile in Austria and Switzerland, told Murphy that under Patton's administration, Bavaria was reverting to exactly the kind of conservative reactionary coalition that had enabled Hitler's rise. Bruno Goldhammer, representing Bavaria's communist faction, reported that former SS concentration camp guards remained employed in administrative positions because they possessed technical knowledge nobody else had. The paradox that destroyed Patton was this: he was partially correct. Bavaria's government, under Minister-President Schaefer, had personally reviewed 5,047 questionnaires for civil servants. American military government officers had rejected exactly one of those approvals. In 4 months, Bavaria had removed 49,887 Nazi officials from office, a removal rate of 411 per day. But the question wasn't whether denazification was happening, the question was whether it was happening sincerely or merely for show. And Patton's press conference had just answered that question. Within 72 hours, Eisenhower would be forced to act. The morning of September 26, 1945, dawned cold over Bad TL's. Temperature at 0700 hours, 11 degrees Celsius. Patton had already read the newspapers. The New York Times editorial, published that morning, was brutal when General Patton belittles the very purpose for which the war in Europe was fought, namely the denazification of Germany. We do not believe that he speaks for the American people or the American army. PM newspaper's headline was simpler: Patton's Nazi views. At 1100 hours, Patton convened a second press conference. This time, he brought a prepared statement, typed on Third Army letterhead and reviewed by his staff judge advocate. The correspondents, including several who hadn't attended the first conference but had flown in specifically to cover the crisis, waited while Patton read from the paper. He acknowledged that General Eisenhower had written to him on September 12, 10 days before the controversial press conference, explicitly warning him that the discussion stage of the denazification program was long past and any expressed opposition to the faithful execution of the order cannot be regarded leniently by me. Patton had received that letter. He had read that letter. He had ignored that letter. Now, attempting to salvage his command, he tried to walk it back. He said his comparison of Nazis to American political parties had been unfortunate in my selection of analogies. He insisted he had been misunderstood. He claimed he was faithfully executing his commanding officer's orders with the same loyalty I showed in the war. But even in his prepared apology, Patton couldn't help himself. He maintained, in writing, in front of 18 correspondents, that it would be necessary to put up with some Nazis in business to get through this winter. Parker Buhrman, sitting in the corner again, watched the correspondents write furiously. Nothing Patton had said would fix the problem. If anything, he'd made it worse. That same afternoon, September 26, 1945, at 15:30 hours, Eisenhower's headquarters issued a new directive. Effective immediately, Law No. 8 was promulgated. All German businesses employing members of the Nazi Party or its affiliates in any capacity above common labor would be summarily closed. Corporate officials violating the order would face prosecution in military courts. It was the exact opposite of everything Patton had advocated. The German reaction was immediate and visceral. Heinrich Müller's brief hope, that 4-day window of relief, evaporated. By September 29th, another 3,247 Germans had been removed from positions in Bavaria alone. The purge accelerated beyond anything seen in the previous 4 months. On September 28th, the announcement came via official military channels. General Lucian K. Truscott Jr. would replace Patton as commander of Third Army. Patton would be transferred to command of 15th Army, a headquarters unit tasked with documenting the war's history. A job for historians and clerks, not warriors. The change of command ceremony occurred October 7, 1945, at Bad Tiels. Weather records show 14 degrees Celsius, overcast skies, wind from the northwest at 12 kilometers per hour. Patton stood before the Third Army staff he had led from the beaches of Normandy to the Czechoslovak border, a distance of 1,100 kilometers covered in 281 days of combat. He wore his dress uniform, 3 stars gleaming, 15 ribbons in perfect rows, cavalry boots polished to mirrors. He spoke for 6 minutes and 14 seconds. An aide recorded the speech. The transcript survives in the National Archives. "All good things must come to an end," Patton said. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, was quiet. "The best thing that has ever happened to me thus far is the honor and privilege of having commanded the Third Army." He didn't mention denazification. He didn't mention the press conferences. He didn't apologize for comparing Nazis to Republicans and Democrats. He didn't acknowledge why he was being removed. Eisenhower didn't attend the ceremony. He didn't send a telegram. He didn't send a representative. The relief was announced through administrative channels, processed like transferring a supply clerk. For Wehrmacht officers confined in POW camps across Bavaria, watching from behind barbed wire, the symbolism couldn't have been clearer. Patton, the most dangerous Allied commander they'd faced, hadn't been defeated on any battlefield. He'd been destroyed by politics. The Americans were purging their own general just as ruthlessly as they'd purged German bureaucrats. The warrior culture the Germans thought they'd recognized, the culture that valued effectiveness over ideology, was gone. The Americans, it turned out, were absolutely serious about denazification. And they would tolerate no dissent. The consequences unfolded over the following weeks with bureaucratic precision that would have impressed the Reich's own administrators. By December 1945, Bavaria had removed 94,133 former Nazis from positions of authority, nearly double the number removed during Patton's tenure. Wilhelm Hoegner, the new minister-president installed by Eisenhower on September 30th, prosecuted the denazification policy with an efficiency that left no room for compromise. Hoegner had credentials Patton never understood. He'd fled Germany on June 16, 1933, just months after Hitler became Chancellor, and spent 12 years in exile in Austria and Switzerland. The OSS had brought him back to Munich on June 6, 1945. He wasn't a pragmatist, he was a true believer, and he intended to rebuild Bavaria correctly, even if it took longer, even if it cost more, even if it meant temporary dysfunction. The statistics proved Patton wrong on every practical claim he'd made. Bavaria didn't collapse into chaos, the water systems continued operating. Food was distributed, not perfectly, but adequately. Schools opened in October with new teachers who had never worn party armbands. The trains ran. The postal service delivered letters. The Germans who replaced the fired Nazis weren't as experienced. Mistakes were made. A food distribution error in Munich in November resulted in 42,000 civilians receiving half rations for 3 days. Industrial production in Bavaria dropped 17% between September and December, the steepest decline in any occupation zone. But the alternative, Patton's alternative, was being demonstrated in real time in the British and French zones, where denazification was enforced with less ideological rigidity. There, former Nazi administrators remained in civil service positions, in factory management, in municipal governments. By 1947, Allied investigators would document what Germans had known immediately. The old networks persisted where they were tolerated. The same men who had administered Hitler's racial laws were administering occupation housing policy. Patton never acknowledged the error. He never had the chance. On December 9, 1945, at approximately 11:45 hours near Mannheim, Germany, Patton's 1938 Cadillac Model 75 limousine, traveling at approximately 50 kilometers per hour, collided with a U.S. Army 2.5-ton truck making a left turn into a quartermaster depot. The driver, PFC Horace L. Woodring, and the other passenger, Major General Hobart Gay, Patton's chief of staff, were uninjured. Patton sustained a broken neck, cervical vertebrae C3 and C4 crushed. He was paralyzed from the neck down. For 12 days he lay in traction at the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, 19 kilometers from the accident site. His wife Beatrice flew from Boston to be at his bedside. For a few days, doctors reported minor improvements, slight movement in his fingers, better respiratory function. On December 21, 1945, at 17:55 hours, a blood clot from his paralyzed lower body worked its way to his heart. General George Smith Patton, Jr. died in his sleep at age 60. He was buried December 24, 1945, Christmas Eve, at the American Cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg, alongside 5,076 soldiers of his Third Army killed during the Battle of the Bulge. Here's what Patton fundamentally misunderstood and why it destroyed him. He believed competence existed independently from character, that a man who had efficiently administered a Nazi bureaucracy could efficiently administer an Allied one with equal moral indifference. That technical knowledge was politically neutral. That rebuilding Germany was an engineering problem requiring engineers, regardless of what those engineers had built before. The Germans knew better. They'd lived through 12 years of extraordinary competence applied to unimaginable evil. They'd watched brilliant administrators organize the Holocaust with the same efficiency they'd once organized railway timetables. They'd seen talented engineers design gas chambers with the same technical precision they'd used designing water pumps. They'd witnessed the smartest people in every room commit the worst crimes in history. Patton's mistake wasn't tactical, it was philosophical. He thought you could separate what a man knew from what a man believed. That expertise was a tool without moral dimension. That Germany could be rebuilt like a bridge, you simply needed people who understood load-bearing structures, regardless of what structures they'd built before or who they'd crushed beneath them. But rebuilding Germany wasn't engineering. It was moral reconstruction. The point wasn't merely to make the trains run on time. The trains had run perfectly on time from 1933 to 1945. They'd run on time delivering people to death camps. The point wasn't efficiency. The point was ensuring efficiency served different masters, different values, different ends. Ideology matters. Character matters. Past behavior predicts future behavior, not perfectly, not always, but reliably enough that you cannot simply ignore it in the name of expediency. The counterintuitive truth Patton never grasped: sometimes the slower path is the only path. Sometimes incompetent Democrats are preferable to competent fascists. Sometimes you must accept short-term dysfunction to prevent long-term catastrophe. Sometimes rebuilding takes longer because you're building something fundamentally different, not just repairing what broke. Effectiveness without ethics isn't effectiveness. It's just efficiency in service of whoever holds power, and that efficiency can serve anyone. The Germans learnt that lesson between 1933 and 1945, watching their most competent institutions commit their most terrible crimes. Patton died before learning it. The lesson stands.